The technician pulled his headphones down over his ears with the practiced action of one hand. "Quiet please. Everybody," he emphasized. 15 seconds. He lifted his arm as the introductory theme music filled the studio air. There were more loud clicks as the final spotlights were switched on, bathing the two men sat on soft leather chairs in light. 7 seconds. 5, 4. On air. The technician's arm swept down to point at one of the two, as the fingers on his outstretched hand described the dwindling moments until only the 4 and index remained. The man sat relaxed, his own fingers subconsciously marking the same time as they casually rested on the chair's arm. His face took on the practiced smile as he stared almost comically into the camera lens. Even before he had taken the signal, the theme music died away and he began to speak in a refined, almost too cultured, voice. "Good evening, and welcome to Dateline, Citywide. I'm Michael Frank, bringing you the latest on Midland's personalities." There was a pause as the camera backed away, widening the view to show both men. Our guest tonight would be familiar to readers of popular fantasy. He turned away from the camera towards the other seated figure as he reached to an open hardcover book on the low table between them. He lifted the book from the table as friends would when alone in a room, though maybe not a room decorated with a backdrop of ghostly shapes and occult objects. As the writer of the immensely popular Dream Maker movies and of course the series of novels Hollywood based the blockbusters on, the camera frame changed to show only the writer's face. But how many of our viewers would know that he spent a good many of his early years, including all of his schooling here, in Leicester? He paused briefly as the image of the second man filled the screen. "I welcome author, Nicholas Sheridan." There was clapping from an appreciative audience, though from far less hands than the intensity implied. The view expanded, showing both men facing each other. Michael continued with an ease gained after many, many interviews. "Of course Nicholas Sheridan is a name you assumed for your writing career. You were Mark Hill in those days, weren't you?" His victim, for that was how Nicholas, or Mark felt, seemed uncomfortable. He moved in the chair as if the suit, or unaccustomed tie, was suddenly shrinking about his body and throat. "Yes. Michael, that's quite right." There was a silence while the interviewer waited for him to continue. Mark looked nervously out into the small audience, but no help came. "I took the name of my main character when the first of the Legends books was published." Michael sensed the discomfort this shy man took in the thought of opening his personal life to the public, and deftly changed the subject. "Well, my first question then is, do I call you Nicholas, or Mark?" "It doesn't really matter, I've got used to both." "So Mark," the smile again. "My first real question was one that was asked by my 12-year-old daughter." He paused for humorous effect. "Where do you get all of your characters from? Are they purely imaginary, or are they people who you meet, or know?" Maybe I should have said my first 3 questions. On cue from a technician, the audience laughed. "They are all imaginary." Michael gave a knowing smile. "Good answer, we wouldn't want to land the program in a courtroom dispute." Mark knew his answer wasn't entirely true. "I do meet interesting people, some have particular, sometimes fascinating behavior. Occasionally I use them, the behaviors, but in an abstract way." He tried to be funny. "I guess I could get sued a lot if somebody recognized themselves, but nobody seemed to notice the humor." He breathed deeply. "Normally, at least in the Legend books, I can rehash characters over and over." Talking now about the books and the people in them, his anxiety eased, and for a while he almost could imagine there was no one else but Michael and him. They settled down to a relatively easy exchange of question and answer, but to Mark the following minutes seemed to pass agonizingly slow, but pass they did, eased on a little by the fact that he was talking about something that consumed him. Michael's tone of voice changed as if he suddenly had a purpose. "If I can bring you back again, Mark, to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned your story and characters seem to spring into life in your mind, but surely sometimes that may involve personal experience?" Mark did not detect the deliberate way he was being guided. "No. Actually, my life isn't that exciting. I get around a lot, Obviously sometimes I see or hear something that is out of the ordinary. If I do, I'll make a note in case I could use it in a story sometime." It was almost as if he walked unwittingly into the question. "I ask that, Mark, because I understand that one of your early short stories, titled, Michael looked down at his prompt sheet though he didn't have to, Bushby Hall, was based on a personal experience?" For a moment Mark couldn't speak. He was surprised, shocked even. He had not known that question would be brought into the interview. It had taken him years to forget about it, his first try at a writing competition. It was poorly written and stood no chance, but was a story he had to tell. The organizers never even acknowledged it had been received, and Mark had pushed the experience into the dark corners of his mind. But somebody had seen it, more than that, they had remembered it. Instantly it was as if it was then, 3,000 words, written so many years before, right after it happened. Mark suddenly realized the interviewer was staring at him, expecting an answer. "Sorry, I was quoting that its claimed authors of horror write about the things that frighten them the most. A sort of exorcising of their own devils. I hadn't really thought about it in that way." "Well, Mark, can I put it this way, a lot of your tales have confined spaces in them, especially the Bushby Hall story. Is there any personal significance in cramped spaces?" Michael seemed to be getting exasperated. "Yes. Do all the caverns, tunnels, and small rooms mean anything more than a setting?" Of course they did, Mark thought, but he was not alone in that. "I suffer from claustrophobia," he blurted out in admission. For a second Michael almost lost his composure. "I was under the impression that the Bushby Hall story was a recollection of something that you actually experienced." "It was, but mostly it was fantasy." "Sorry, Mark," Michael gave a less than convincing smile to the audience. "It seems our research people have slipped up. They have here that Bushby Hall was the genesis of your writing career?" "It was." Michael seemed flustered and looked to the side of the stage as if he wanted to end the interview. "Then, maybe you could clarify for the audience. Everything is imaginary, except that Bushby Hall existed?" "It existed," Mark said firmly. "Everything else was fantasy." "Including the sacrifices?" "Sacrifices?" Mark desperately tried to think of when he had written about sacrifices, but it wasn't something he would have. Back in medieval times, there were supposedly sacrifices at Bushby Hall? Oh, those? Yes, there are stories of people disappearing. As for sacrifice, they are more probably just things people made up to cover an unexplained death. I never came across anything that proved they were sacrifices. Then what about the rumors that say there were dragons? I'm told that some of the myths that have passed down about virgins tied to stakes, who had mysteriously disappeared by the next morning, could have originated from Bushby Hall. Mark shook his head. It was a superstitious time. It's possible stories could have been fabricated to cover murder. When something is unsolved over time, it becomes myth. Yes, dark times indeed, so it seems it wasn't called the Dark Ages for nothing. There was an orchestrated peal of laughter as Michael relaxed a little. Then the tunnel was not where you overcame your claustrophobia? It actually did have a tunnel. Well, there was an archway. Bushby Hall, yes, it was real, but that's where the truth ended and fiction began. The memories were washing through his mind. Mostly there was regret. It was still there, in his heart he knew he should have. We believed there were tunnels, but I never went through the archway. Then maybe you would like to tell the viewers what actually happened. The young boy got up from the floor mesmerized by the screen. He walked to the television, turning up the volume. A female voice, firm but without anger, called from the kitchen. "Terry, turn it down." "But Mom, it's really interesting," the boy said, not taking his eyes away from the two men. "I don't care." Reluctantly he did as he was told, but remained standing far too close, listening intently. "So you never saw Bushby Hall again, Mark?" "My family emigrated to Australia shortly afterwards. I never came back, that is until now." Michael nodded, closing the book and placing it on the table, then relaxing back into his chair. "Thank you, Nicholas Sheridan." The scene zoomed into a head and shoulders of the interviewer as he spoke directly to the camera. A fascinating story from a remarkable local man. A great talent out of our own city. Join me next week, when I will have as a guest in the studio. Terry Parker watched as the credits rolled. Up over the two men still sat talking soundlessly. Okay. That's it. Bed. The voice was nearer. Ah, Mum. The woman was stood behind him. Bed, Terry. I let you stay up to watch this far, but now it's bedtime. Mummy's really famous, and he came from here. He even wrote his first story, about right where we live. Maybe he did, but tomorrow is Sunday, and I promised the vicar that you would be at church early, for a change. There was something familiar about the man stood under the boughs of the old sycamore tree. It was not that Terry knew him, he was certain they had never met, but all the same he could not help walking closer. The man wasn't doing anything, just staring out over the park area. Suddenly Terry felt nervous. After all, the police had issued warnings about another possible attack by the Houghton killer. People had disappeared before from the district, and only last night on the television they were asking people to watch for anything unusual or for suspicious people. But that was the problem with the man at the tree. Sure, he looked strange, dressed in a long dark coat and a hat. A hat like a cowboy's, but flatter. He was just standing there doing nothing, but there was something. Terry felt he knew him, but couldn't remember where from or when. He had to get closer. He was maybe 50 meters away now. Terry sped up his strides, ready to run past at the first sign of trouble. The man had not seen him. He was still looking towards the grassed area of the playground as if in a trance. He was not a local, that was for sure. Terry was too close, he'd be seen any moment now. He was about to break off to the side, or into a run, he wasn't sure which, when he recognized the stranger. No wonder he looked so familiar. He had been on the television only last night. It was Nicholas Sheridan. Strange behavior, or not, this was too much of a chance to miss. His favorite author, writer of some of the best horror stories he had ever read, in Houghton, and meters away. Terry forgot all the advice and warnings and walked straight up to him. "Excuse me." "What?" Mark almost jumped, taken unawares. He had been lost in his thoughts. "You are Nicholas Sheridan?" Terry said, dreading a negative reply. The youth before him seemed frightened. With short brown hair, and wearing what were probably his best clothes, Mark guessed he was close to 15, maybe less, but he was never sure of children's ages. "Yes." The boy's eyes widened as a smile spread over his face. "I knew it. I'm your greatest fan." "You are?" Mark smiled. "Well, I'm honored, Terry. Terry Parker." "Thank you, Terry. I'm pleased you like my writing." "Oh, I really do, and so do my friends. You make it seem so real." Mark smiled back at him, not entirely sure how to reply. "Nobody will believe you're here, and I met you." "I'm sure they will, Terry. They'll all be jealous." Mark felt uncomfortable at the unashamed admiration. "Well, Terry, it was nice to meet you, but I'd better be getting going." "No," Terry blurted out. Mark smiled again. "Sorry, Terry. I have to, things to do, places to go, you know. But nobody will believe me." Almost instantly the idea came to the boy's mind. "Can I have your autograph?" "Sure." Mark put his hand into the inside pocket of his jacket, withdrawing it empty. "Have you got a pen?" The boy patted his pockets. "No," he muttered in disappointment. "I'm sorry, Terry. I didn't bring anything to write with, but it's been nice to meet you." Mark wasn't sure how to exit, so with a casual wave he just turned and began to walk slowly across the grass. Terry had dreamed that something like this would happen one day, but now he didn't know what to say, but his idol was going to walk out of his life and leave him with nothing. "You're here because of Bushby Hall, aren't you?" he called out in desperation. Mark stopped, turned and stared at the youth. "I don't know how you know that, but that's pretty much right on Terry." In half a dozen steps the boy stood alongside him. "I always thought there was something strange about the estate, what with all the cat and dogs going missing, and I don't think it's the tiger." There's more to it than that. Mark had no idea what he was talking about. You've lost me, Terry. They say it's the tiger that lives out in the countryside that takes them all. What a real tiger. That's what they say, but I don't believe it. I think it's all to do with Bushby Hall. Bushby Hall was a long time ago, Terry. It's no more than one of my own legends now, a fairy tale. Then why are you here? I'm here to put an ending to it. To finish the story, have you wrote another story about Bushby Hall? No. No. There's no story, there's nothing. It's more like unfinished personal business. Mark's words dwindled away and he turned to look back over the grass. I'd forgotten about the hall until last night. Well, I suppose I hadn't forgotten, just learned to push it to the back of my mind. Why would you want to do that? I don't know. It's something people do a lot as we grow up. Like all the ideas of making the world a better place gradually seem less important once we have jobs and responsibilities. We still want to see them happen, but time has slipped by. Terry nodded knowingly. My mom says she was going to lots of things, but it's never the right time, or the right place. I don't think there's ever a right time or place, Terry. Maybe we should both remember that if it's important, then find the time. Bushby Hall must have been important or you would have forgotten it. More important than I realized. Last night it seemed as if I had been drawn back here to end, and the not knowing. Now you've lost me. Mark smiled. Sorry, I guess I'm talking in riddles. Let's just say that all through my travels there's a part of me that never left here, kind of like an unfulfilled dream me. Waiting, knowing that one day I would have to face the regret. Regret? As he spoke, Terry realized he was intruding, but he had to keep talking. I don't mean to be nosy, at least he felt he'd apologized. That's all right, it's no big deal really. I shouldn't have kept it secret. Mom says secrets eat a hole in your relationships. Not your relationships. He added quickly. I mean, I don't know if you have any relationships. Terry suddenly felt out of his depth. I mean, you must know lots of famous girls. Mark almost laughed. Some, but not as many as you're probably thinking. Mark smiled again and self-consciously crunched the dry leaves under his foot. Yes, I did keep it secret, and I shouldn't have. I should have told everybody about it years ago, exorcised it. Exorcised it? Come to terms with it, washed it out of my mind. Then why didn't you? I don't know. Well, at first I suppose it was fear. Then as I grew up maybe I thought people would think me silly. Grown-ups don't like to look silly. That's the thing with growing up, we have to be grown up, but actually it's not very clever to hide your feelings. He looked at the boy. I was wrong. I should have talked about it a long time ago instead of leaving it all into fiction, losing reality amongst my fantasy, and then trying to forget it. Maybe if I had done things differently, maybe that would have ended it long ago. You can tell me. I'll listen to you. Now Mark did laugh. So it seems, but your mother will be worrying where you've got to. You had better get along home, or wherever you were going. The words were in Terry's mouth almost before he thought of them. Come with me? Mark was sure he misunderstood. What? Come home with me, Terry said slightly less confidently. To your home? Mark was taken off guard at the sudden invitation. Come to my house, the ideal solution formed in Terry's mind. There's a pen at my house, and I can get your autograph, and you can tell me the story? Mark stood looking at him, his surprised mind unable to think of a reason to decline the offer. Terry took Mark's indecision as acceptance. Mom always has a cup of coffee when I get home. Do you want one? We don't get many visitors. I'm certain she'll want to meet you too. No, Terry. Mark managed to squeeze in. Your mom and dad won't be pleased with you for talking to a stranger, never mind bringing one home for morning tea. Please. Please. Terry tried to put on his most pleading voice. It nearly always worked with his mom. No one will believe that I've met you. If you don't, all my friends will say I'm making meeting you up. Mark didn't want to dishearten the boy, but neither did he want a situation. Terry, I don't think it's a good idea. The boy seemed to ignore him. And my mom has never met anybody famous before. I'm sorry, Terry. If you are going back to the main road, you will have to walk past my house. For a moment Mark thought about going the long way. I do have to walk that way. I'll race and get a pen. You don't have to come in. Mom will be really excited to meet you. Mark let out a resigned sigh. All right. I'll walk with you to your door. Say hello, sign an autograph, and then I'm gone. Okay? Terry was bursting with excitement. It's a deal. This way. The boy started off, and then turned, waiting for the man to follow. You were going to tell me about Bushby Hall. Was I? Mark wasn't sure he was. I suppose, but where do I begin? Last night, you said you could start at the end, or in the middle. I did too, but this story starts at the very beginning, and with a boy around your age. The crunch of leaf turned to clicks of leather heels on paving, the sound went before them down the deserted street. His uncle was a demolition contractor. One day the uncle got a contract from a developer to clear a site for a new housing estate. It was in demolition terms, an easy job. There were brick walls, terraces, greenhouses, and a house. A fine old house. It wasn't derelict, or even dilapidated, just not needed anymore. My mom said there are lots of people who need houses now. Yes, there are, Terry, maybe unneeded was the wrong word. It was too big. Too many rooms for even the biggest family. I'm sure none of the people your mother was talking about would like to clean a very big house. Terry nodded in acceptance. Dilapidated, does that mean it was falling down? No, more, uncared for. For a writer, I'm getting all my words mixed up. I sometimes do that. Do you think I could write books? I'm sure you could, Terry. What I meant was that there were strong walls and a sound roof. Inside, the paneled halls and carved balustrades were all in good condition, but nobody had lived there for a long time and it wasn't looked after. This is Bushby Hall? Mark nodded. Anyway, there was no reason, at least no good reason at any rate, to pull it down, other than for profit and a disregard for. For what? It doesn't matter to our story. Anyway, the boy was there, too young, too naive to see what he was part of, and the uncle did as he was paid to do. It was his job. You were the boy, weren't you? Mark hesitated. Yes. I was. Why don't you say you were? He couldn't answer, but he knew why. It was easier to imagine being a character in a book than acknowledge reality. His hesitation was long enough for Terry to control the conversation again. So they pulled it down? Yes. But it was not as easy as that. Well, not as they had expected. At the time, some said the house fought back. More skeptical people said it was coincidence, but things happened. What kind of things? Trivial things. Thinking back now, if each thing had happened on its own, it probably wouldn't have been worth a passing comment. But putting everything together, and with the benefit of hindsight, he smiled knowingly. That's something we all wished we could have. Well, it seemed that there was a slow progression of happenings. I don't understand, some things happened. Like I said, just trivial things, hardly worth mentioning type things. But they noticed them at the time. Yes, but I was a joke at the start. It certainly wasn't any more than was always said to happen in places that were supposed to be haunted. Terry stopped in surprise. Haunted? You didn't say it was haunted. Mark slowed and turned back towards the boy. Didn't I? Maybe I didn't, but there wouldn't be a house over 100 years old that hasn't a ghost in residence, at least as far as some would say. Terry began walking again. And Bushby Hall had one? Yes, Bushby had its ghost. There was supposed to have been a servant girl who threw herself out of an attic window. Nobody knew why. The boy's eyes widened. And you saw the ghost? Once. Well, actually, I didn't see anything. Just one night we went there at midnight. For a bit of fun, really, though nobody was game to go inside. Mark suddenly felt cold. Years had passed, but it was just as if it were happening again. His steps faltered. We stood in the garden and watched. I can't forget it. Just before 12. There was a candle, carried by someone. Or something, I couldn't see. It kind of floated by one of the attic windows. We didn't wait after that, we left pretty quickly. Terry seemed disappointed. You never saw anything else? No, that was it. I suppose it doesn't sound much now, does it? Terry didn't reply. Almost as if he had to justify himself, Mark carried on. We really began to notice the other things after that. Other things? Like I said, trivial stuff. The smell of cigar smoke in the study, every night at 5 o'clock. It was only later when the demolition started that the things became more mischievous. A workman's hammer slipping off the roof, when all the precautions had been taken, and nearly hitting another man, things like that. What about you? Did you have anything happen to you? There was a room, a bathroom, attached to the master bedroom. It was full of old exposed brass pipes and decorated porcelain. Would have been very posh when the house was built. It had a sliding door between it and the bedroom. One day I went in and shut the door behind me. Then I had this feeling that someone was outside. I didn't take too much notice. I thought it was probably one of the workmen. Anyway, when I came to leave, the lock had somehow dropped into place, and I was trapped. Then what? I called from the window. I wasn't afraid, more embarrassed. It was a foolish thing to do. My sister came up and slid the door open, as easy as that. She was pretty upset that I was making all the fuss. That doesn't sound very eerie. No, I don't suppose it does now, and it wouldn't have been then. Except that when we looked, there was no lock on the door, nor any catch. There was no way it could have locked. It merely slid open and closed. They walked on in silence, both thinking their own thoughts. It was a week later that the chimney opened the cellar. Began Mark. No one had even known there was a cellar under the old kitchen until the brickwork crashed through. Terry's interest rose. A secret cellar? Not so much secret as a hidden cellar. What was there? Nothing. Nothing? Terry sounded disappointed. It was just an empty room. What was so special about an empty room? Sometimes, Terry, when something isn't there, it can be more frightening than when there is. Terry wasn't sure he agreed, but he tried to look understanding. There were two opposing walls of stone block. Big hand-hewn stone, like on the church down there. Mark pointed across the green. Between them was a set of stone steps, nearly the full length of the wall from top to bottom. They were worn smooth and rounded from countless feet. My sister did a bit of research and found out that back in the Dark Ages there had been a keep on the site. Once we knew that, it seemed logical that the cellar had survived in the foundations from that time. Anyway, the wall opposite that had two arches in the same stone material. They had turned now into a nondescript street lined with small two-floor houses, set in neat gardens, two at a time. Thing is that the arches that were wrong. Everything in the cellar was built centuries ago to last centuries, but both of the arches had been quickly and roughly sealed with small clay bricks. You could see they had been hurriedly placed, mortar had oozed out between them, and just left hanging. The lines were not level, and some bricks were even misshapen, as if the brickie had grabbed anything available. It seemed whoever had laid them had been in an awful hurry to close off whatever was behind. Anyway, after the cellar was open, the site became chaotic. A second workman nearly fell off the roof, another down the staircase. Timber and more hammers fell, or were misplaced between floors. Rumors sprang up everywhere about the ghost wreaking revenge, so much so that some laborers and tradesmen refused to work there. 3 days later, my uncle bulldozed the brickwork from around the site into the cellar. He packed it solid with as much rubble as he could. He could have sold most of it as hard fill, but he didn't even try and save any of the fitting or fixtures. He just dozed the lot. Then what happened? Nothing. That was it. Nothing happened at all. The ghost had got his way. Terry said, convinced at his statement. How do you mean? Well, the ghost was trying to warn you. Prevent you from doing something. Then when you stopped, he had no need to warn you anymore. Actually, you should consider a career in writing, Terry. Mark smiled. But your theory has a flaw. The ghost didn't get his way. The house was gone. They both walked a little further in silence. You said you had some regrets? They were at the gate of a house that was identical to another tent in the street. It gave off a pleasant homely feel, and looked well tendered, although Mark's eye told him that many of the minor maintenance jobs, usually regarded as those done by the male of the household, seemed to have gone unfinished. Did I? Was that about the cellar, and the archways? That we didn't go through the wall, to find what we may have found? The ghost? Maybe? Or a monster? Terry ate eagerly. Mark laughed. I doubt it, Terry, real life isn't so dramatic. I've no doubt we would have found an old wine cellar, or water well. Whatever, it would have been something quite mundane, and thinking back probably quite disappointing. No, instead I learned to live with my imagination, and my own monsters. Good heavens, what would have happened to my career, if I had my dreams dashed at such an impressionable age? I probably would have never picked up a pen. Mark waited as Terry ran up the garden path, opened the front door lock, and went through. Mark waited, slightly embarrassed, and not quite sure how he had ended up standing at a stranger's front gate. He could hear voices, subdued except for what he thought was a shocked. You did what? He had an irrational urge to run, but judging by the noise, Terry was literally dragging another person to the door. A flustered woman, younger than Mark had imagined, appeared, obviously straight from her baking, as traces of flour still clung to her cheeks, half hidden by shoulder-length black hair. Mark had not given the boy's mother a great deal of thought as they had walked to the house. In fact, he hadn't given her any. Now he wondered why. She tried to smooth down her skirt with both hands, suddenly feeling the wisp of hair that had fallen across her face. I'm sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Mark called out, feeling even more embarrassed. Parker, Terry called back proudly. Mrs. Parker. Mark gave a grin, then stopped. He already looked foolish enough. Look, I'm sorry. I can see you're busy, but Terry insisted. He wanted to get a pen. No, Mr. Sheridan, there's no problem, Terry has explained. It's I who should apologize for him dragging you here. She gave the boy a stern glance, and for a moment her mouth tightened, before she looked back at Mark. I wasn't really dragged, and it's no problem to me either. So, he tried to act relaxed, though for some reason the woman made him very uneasy, in the nicest of ways. I'm sure I am interrupting you, and as I said, I only came round so Terry could prove to his friends that he had met me. The words trailed off. She had a smile on her face. Was she laughing at him? I'm sorry, that sounds very self-important, doesn't it? I didn't mean it to come out that way. She shook her head, making her hair shimmer. Please come in, Terry loves your books, that is if you have the time. I don't want to disturb, he began, then stopped. He didn't really have anywhere important to go, and she was really quite attractive. You're sure? Mark opened the front gate as she stepped back, opening the door wider, in an inviting way. Then I'll only trouble you for a few minutes, Mrs. Parker. There is one condition. Mark stopped. If you come in, you must call me Avril. Mrs. Parker makes me feel old. The few minutes stretched on to 10, and past that. And you never came back, before now. No, I used to think about coming back, but that was a long time ago. We've lived here for a while and never suspected there was anything mysterious. Maybe the developers thought ghost stories would scare people off. Then it worked. It's a very ordinary, very unexciting bit of suburbia, where on the estate was the building. I don't actually know now. I thought I would remember when I came out this morning, but I don't recognize anything anymore. As you said, it was a long ago. Mark shrugged. Yeah, everything changes. I was just about to give up when Terry found me. Mom, I need a pen, interrupted the boy, jumping up as he remembered the excuse he had used. Haven't you got one in your school bag? I've only got pencils. Look in my bag, it's in my room. She turned back to Mark. I wish I could help, but we only moved in 3 years ago, just before my husband. Her words trailed off. Mark wasn't sure what she was implying, or was about to say. He didn't ask. She looked away, then at him. He left us. The words were rapidly delivered, almost defensively. One day he just went out, and he never came back. I'm sorry. I don't want to. Avril's face took on a look of embarrassment as her sudden outburst. Her were much softer. We're over it now, kind of. It's just we never could understand why he. It took Terry a long time to come to terms with his father leaving. He still misses him. Now Mark felt uncomfortable. I didn't intend to bring up something you'd rather put behind you. She smiled regretfully. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said. It's still hard coming to terms with not knowing what went wrong, and sometimes. There was an awkward silence, and Mark thought maybe he should take the chance to leave, but for some reason he didn't want to. Instead he sought for something to change the subject. He remembered his conversation with Terry by the tree. Terry said you have a legend of your own? We do? Avril looked puzzled. The tiger? Oh that, she said almost dismissively. That was years ago. If it ever was true, the poor thing would be long dead by now. Tell me about it. Tell you about the tiger. Well, there's nothing to tell. It was just an animal that escaped. You never know, I may be able to use it in a book. Brilliant, called Terry from just inside the next room. Can you put me in as well? Mark smiled and looked in a conspiratorial way at his mother. I'm sure I can, Terry. Go on, Mom, tell him. Terry called back. She smiled with a really cute smile. As I said, there's not much to tell. It was at the time that the first houses were being built on the estate. A circus set up the big top on one of the fields close by, and one night a tiger escaped. It was never found. That's all there is to it. It just escaped. The police said it was set free, shouted Terry from the kitchen. No, they said the door was broken off its hinges. Same thing. He shouted back. And it was never found? Said Mark. Not a trace. The authorities looked for it, of course, and there were any number of people who said they had seen it, from as far away as Nottingham. The police said it probably found a hole somewhere and died. I expect it would have out in the cold. No. It had been raised in England, so it should have been acclimatized. She thought for a moment. Can animals like that get acclimatized? It probably doesn't matter anyway, as they found some blood on the cage floor, and assumed it had been injured breaking out, and died in some cave of its injuries. There are lots of caves around here. So being as it was never found, the myth that it still stalks out there, came about? Yes, all the stories. She laughed, then suddenly stopped. Though, since then, whenever anyone on the estate lets their dog or cat wander at night, the animals can disappear without a trace, just the same as. At that moment Terry burst into the room. I know where it is. I said, in my bag. No. The cellar, Mr. Meadows at 43, he told me. Mark doesn't want. It's okay, Afro, actually I'd like to hear what Terry has to say. Then don't say I didn't warn you, Mark. Once he starts on something. She stood collecting the cup from him. Some more coffee? He didn't really want any more, but he didn't want to leave either. Please. Avril left the room. Terry, who is Mr. Meadows? He's a pensioner, across on Boundary Street. I go round every couple of weeks to mow his lawn for him. The boy made no attempt to sit down, but stood directly in front of Mark, excitedly looking down at him. So how would he know where the cellar was? He was the works foreman for the council back when the estate was built. Go on. Mr. Meadows talks to me about all the places he's been, and the things he's done. I just remembered, he told me about when they were laying the pipes. They were blasting through an old stone wall. There was an accident. A workman was buried when the trench caved in. Mark turned the hired car onto the main road, oblivious to the repeating click of the indicator failing to cancel. His thoughts were confused. He had eaten a very pleasant early lunch, and was more interested in seeing young Terry's mother again than he wanted to admit. But as he changed gear, and accelerated back towards the city, Terry's recollections about the pipe cutting through the foundations reawakened more than the simple curiosity that had brought him here a few hours earlier. Try as he could, Terry's words wouldn't leave him. He still didn't know why he had come back after all these years. A few days ago it hadn't been that important to even stop in Leicester again, yet he had. And this morning something had drawn him back out under the sycamore. Then Terry's memory of the old workman. There was a loud rasping horn, screaming in protest behind him. Mark realized he had inadvertently slowed down to a crawl. The regular click of the indicator surfaced from his subconscious. The horn blared out again, and he swerved to his left, as a large blue truck thundered recklessly by. Mark pulled off to the side of the road, checked behind, then again put on the indicator, as he swung the car back towards Boundary Street. Number 43, Boundary Street was way over to the far end of the development. It had taken some finding, and Mark was sure he had driven up every road that he could have, before the street sign appeared. An old man answered the faded red door. He probably had a fondness for drinking, Mark mused as he took in the massive paunch that hung over the rope serving as a belt. He wore a patched old sweater and woolen gloves that had their fingers cut off. The voice held a definite Irish lilt. I was that, rain or shine, for 6 of the 23 years that I worked for council. Gave me a gold watch when I retired. I've been speaking to a young boy, Terry Parker. He told me that you worked on laying some of the underground pipes through the estate. Some? No, not some, all of EM. Every inch of pipe laid with these hands. He stopped for a moment, his eyes quizzical. How come that's of interest to you? It's my job to be interested in unusual things. The man suddenly became excited. You heard I've seen it? That was damned quick. Mark was taken aback at the surge of interest. He said you were the man to ask about locating. Meadows had begun gesticulating, his arms pointing to the side of the house not 30 feet from where you're standing right now. That's where. Sorry. 30 feet? Mark, puzzled, turned and swept his gaze fruitlessly around him. Round back. The old man said impatiently before he was off leading the way down the side of the house to the rear garden. Come on. Come on. He'd urged. A few moments later they were stood in the small, surprisingly well-tended, enclosed yard. Over here. The man beckoned from in front of a small patch of freshly turned soil. There was a strong smell of organic fertilizer. Behind stood a row of timber and wire cages. Just there, he said. Mark wasn't sure what he was supposed to be looking for, and the old man became annoyed at Mark's confusion. There, are you blind, man? It's just there. He pointed, like a belligerent teacher showing an inattentive child a patch of recently turned earth. He became excited again. First I thought it was them kids larking about again. Couldn't sleep. Lights were off and I opened the door quietly. I did. There it was crouching in the garden, right here. It was dark, just saw the shape, shadowy like. Thought it was a dog first off, but no, much too big. Then I turned the back light on. That made it move, reared up, didn't it, on its back legs. Made a noise, like a dying man's throat rattle. Oh, terrible sound. I've heard men die in war, and that was summit else, but that was in war when you saw things no man should see. Mark was shaking his head bewilderment. Any road, then it leaped straight over me. Rabbits. No, shan't lie, it was gone when I looked. Truth is damn thing scared me so much with its bloody roar I shut door on it. It was after me. Rabbits, that's what it had come for. See. But it was 'em all right. Saw these claw marks in amongst me veggies, it light next morning. At last Mark realized what Meadows was talking about. You're talking about the tiger? What did you think I was talking about, man? Look, sorry I didn't explain. I wanted to ask you about what was left of the old house. He seemed disappointed. You're not from the newspaper? No. Meadows' attitude changed. I thought you were from. He had little interest in an old building. Just about a house? Yes. House, which house? Take your pick. The house that was here before the estate was built. It's no use looking for that, it's gone. Nothing left of it now. I know, but I thought with you laying the pipes you mightn't have seen the foundations. Foundations? Don't know what you're on about. There was no money, or even a picture in tomorrow's paper, but it was clear that the stranger would not leave without something more. I've got the kettle on, come in. Standing here like this the neighbors will think you're the bailiff. He led Mark into the hallway and through to the front room. The room smelled musty and used, and the furniture was covered with white sheets. He pulled one off an upholstered chair. Don't use much of the house, now I'm on me own. He motioned Mark to sit. Tea? No thanks, I've just had some. Then I'll make myself one. He went into the kitchen, calling back through the door. Curious about old storm water pipes, what do you want to know about them for? It's not really the pipe that I'm interested in. Before that time, there used to be an old house here. Mark could hear the chink of a spoon as Meadows stirred his brew. My sister's husband had the contract to demolish the house. I was here when it was pulled down. Meadows listened quietly as he re-entered the room, carrying his chipped cup. He pulled the sheet off another chair and without any doubt in his mind spoke. Bushby house. That's right. You do know about it then? No, I don't know about it, I've heard about it. Supposed to have been a big posh place by all accounts. He sat opposite Mark, noisily slurping his drink. But it wasn't that smart when we came. The grounds were all overgrown with weeds. Like entering a lost land. Nothing else. The high wall was still there, had 2 lions on top of pillars at gate, until lads from university had them away at Rag Week. He chuckled to himself. You saw it, did you? Yes, the grounds were untended then too, but you could still see how they had been laid out from the upper windows. I was young enough, with the wall surrounding the house, and the home farm behind to think I'd found something out of a fairy tale. Mark thought back. I remember wandering the grounds thinking that I was in Sleeping Beauty's castle and that no one else in the world knew about it. Except your brother-in-law. The house was falling down, was it? No, the building was still in good condition. Or at least it looked that way to me. Sounds very nice, but all I remember was rain, mud and hard work when we came on site. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Terry told me that you found the old cellar. Then he's wrong, don't remember no cellar. Mark's hopes fell. There were foundations. I remember them, all over the place. Had to blast through some, but no cellar that I recall. Sorry, can't help you there. No, it's all right, it doesn't really matter. It's not really important. Just one of those life's loose ends I'd have liked to have tied up. Nobody really ever expected to see it again after my uncle filled it up with rubble and I. The old man leaned forward, his interest rekindled. With rubble? You didn't say it was filled up. What with bricks and tile, that kind of stuff? That's right, said Mark, also sitting forward in his chair. Well, now that's a bit different. We came across a load of brick and stuff. Thought somebody had filled in a well, never thought of it before as a cellar. I don't know what its purpose was. It was under the kitchen, so I assumed it. Should never assume out, lad. You should know that at your age. You're quite right, it was just a small room. Whatever it was, we didn't even know there was anything there until the place was half down. It had been sealed up heaven only knows how long before. We only found it when an old chimney fell through the floorboards. Then my brother-in-law bulldozed all the other rubble in, and covered it. Saving money on trucking it out. The old man grumbled. Something like that. Mark allowed him his opinion. The old man leaned back in his chair relieved, as if a puzzle had been solved. Your brother-in-law. So that's who it was. Called him blind we did, took us 3 days to dig a path through it. Had to do it all by hand we did, excavator wouldn't touch it. Planning department wouldn't realign the pipe. Wanted the main trunk to go right through the middle, they did. He shook his head and smiled. A cellar then, was it? We thought he had just found a hole to save on carting the rubble away. So you did find it? Just said I did, didn't I? Do you remember what it was like? The words were slightly sarcastic. Do you know how many years? Meadows stopped and thought. Yes. Yes, of course you do. Long time ago any rate, but I remember, that I do. What I do remember is we didn't dig up more than we had to. There was a stone floor, we dug through that too, and 2 walls, went through both of them as well. Were there any archways? Mark asked anxiously. Archway? Not that I remember. He thought before continuing. Least nothing that looked like any archway. No, them walls we went through were just walls, big slabs though, been there a long time. Do you think the council would have its location marked on their plans? Shouldn't think so, no interest to them, pipe they'd have, but not walls. Any rate they don't need to, I recollect exactly where it was. Now it was Mark's turn to raise his hopes. Could you show me where? Close enough. Know the estate, do you? Not really. I only came back today. Did you see the recreation area? Mark's mind swiftly flew back to the swings and grassed area he had stood at a few hours ago. Yes. Right then, you stand on the inspection cover in the children's play area. Look towards the next pit, you can't miss it, it's near the corner of Houghton Road and Cherry Lane, then walk about 52 yards in that direction, and you're right over it. Mark was amazed that after all those years he could remember the location that easily. You must have laid miles of pipes, how come you remember that bit so well? There was a scraping outside in the garden. Mark looked towards the cloudy glass of the window. Pay no attention, it's only the kids, always larking about trying to get me wound up. He grinned. Bit of a game they think it is, daring each other. I chase them off now and again, makes it more exciting. He stood and walked to the faded net curtain. Pulling it aside he looked out into the street and then up to the overcast sky. How come I remember it so well? That's 'cause I can't forget it, and don't think I've not tried. That was my job, and I was responsible, but through no fault of mine one of my men died in the trench at that very spot. He let out a sad sigh. They said I wasn't to blame, but that didn't help him, did it? As I said, it was filthy weather, ground was like brown porridge, that's if it wasn't rock. He looked with a whimsical smile at Mark. Any road formwork gave way, trench sides caved in and buried him. He fell quiet and just stared out into the clouds. Mark sensed there was no more, maybe already he had asked too much. You've been a great help, thanks a lot. He stood and made to walk towards the front door. The old man spoke again. It was obviously something that had troubled him for a long time. He wasn't looking at Mark, still his gaze was out of the window. He was badly crushed when we dug him out, terrible sight to see a bloke like him, like that. They said the excavator had mutilated him. He seemed as if he was content to talk only to himself. Never did find his right arm though. Dug that hole right out again, we did. Just disappeared it had.